And now, marine weather around Alaska. Hi there, I'm National Weather Service Meteorologist Peter Chan with your marine weather outlook for Alaska as we go into the early first full week of 2024. And looking at the ice across the far north, we've had persistent, very strong easterly winds. There have been some polinias that have opened, but they quickly freeze back up given the cold temperatures that have been near or below zero along the far north. And as we go farther south, we had a push of milder air come into Bristol Bay, east side of Kuskokwim Bay, which really did a number on the ice there. Strong winds also helped to break it up with some melting. And some of the ice was pushed back initially toward the west a bit, but that should stop now. You can see these polinias that have opened up along the lower Yukon Delta, but those should close back up here as winds go back more around with a southwesterly component to them. Looking at the surface weather map, very late tonight, early pre-dawn hours of Monday morning, we have the strong low that at one time was down around 935 millibars or so is now lifting up along the eastern Russia coast into the Gulf of Anadyr. The occluded front extending ahead of it will have weakened, and we have the frontal system trough pushing in, just kind of hugging along the Panhandle coastline. That's responsible for some of the snowfall that is expected this Sunday night into Monday morning. 3 to 5 inches of snow in parts of the southern Panhandle around Ketchikan, Metlakatla, as well as Juneau across the way on over toward Gustavus and up toward Yakutat. But by the time we get into Monday afternoon, we have this low rather weak will stay in the lower Gulf, North Pacific. We still have brisk winds along the Arctic coast there, especially east of Deadhorse toward Kaktovik, that could linger into Monday afternoon. And the low that continues to lift northward and fill across eastern Russia. There is going to be a little compact low that impacts mainly the British Columbia coast. This is eventually going to help turn winds more northeasterly here across the Panhandle beyond Tuesday, and that's going to bring in some colder, drier air along with clear to partly cloudy skies in the Panhandle. So the period of prolonged colder weather is expected to set up here and through especially the central northern Panhandle as we go through the upcoming week. There is another low here off in the lower left of your screen coming out of the North Pacific, well southwest of the Aleutians, though this low is not as deep as the past two lows. Still, though, a reasonable low that'll be crossing up through the central Aleutians as we go into Tuesday afternoon. Otherwise, a bit quieter weather is expected here in the mainland. And the pressure gradient along the eastern Arctic coast will finally relax a bit here for Tuesday. Lagging trough just off of the Panhandle coast. But as I mentioned, eventually this offshore flow will increase as we go through the midweek with high pressure here over northwest Canada. That's going to allow for colder temperatures to settle in across the Panhandle then here for the week ahead. Looking at the marine forecast for Monday, winds will be northwest 15 knots, waves 6-7 feet to Dixon Entrance there. Mid-channels, south winds 20 knots, gust to 35 knots because we have the remnants of that front kind of hanging in through the southwest. North winds, though, along Lynn Canal could gust as high as 35 knots with 3-foot waves. And then the outer coast, we expect winds turning northwest and northerly and then eventually start to become offshore once you get up toward Yakutat. And then notice the trend Tuesday. North winds 15 to 20 knots across the inner channels, bringing in that colder, drier air waves 3 to 4 feet. Outer coast offshore flow generally out of the east-northeast, 20 to as high as 25 knots south of Sitka. Waves running 9 to 12 feet, less so as you get up there toward Cape Suckling. Easterly winds at 15 knots. Much quieter weather, too, across the northwestern Gulf. Variable winds off the Kenai coast and outside of Hinchinbrook Entrance at 10 knots, waves 8-9 feet. South winds to 10 knots within the open waters here of Prince William Sound and 2-foot waves. Lower Cook Inlet, south-southwest winds 15 knots and waves running 2-3 feet. On Tuesday, we'll see winds more northerly within Prince William Sound at 20 knots, waves a few feet. Along the Kenai coast, we're looking at 25 knots winds out of the northwest with maybe 6-7 foot waves. Westerly winds here at the entrance of Cook Inlet to 30 knots with 7-foot waves. Winds will generally be out of the northwest off of Kodiak Island and along the Pacific side of the Alaska Peninsula, turning a little more westerly as you get near and south of Sand Point. Waves 5 to as high as 8 feet. Southwest winds within Shelikof Strait with 3-foot waves. And then look for southwest to west winds at 20 knots on the Bering side of the peninsula into Bristol Bay with waves 6 to as high as 11 feet north of Cold Bay. Cold Bay did get their power taken out. Whether or not that'll be restored right away, they took a pretty good punch of wind there with that strong system that moved through here earlier in the weekend. And then looking at the areas along Kodiak Island, west winds to 20 knots. Winds are going to turn back around to the east, pick up 25 to 30 knots through the lower peninsula there on Tuesday afternoon. And as we look at the Aleutians, much quieter than what has been the case here for the past week. Look for west-southwest winds 15 to 20 knots, eastern half of the Aleutians. Variable winds to 10 knots around Atka and Adak. Turning back to southwest to west 15 to 20 knots for the western Aleutians. Now that next low that's going to be approaching from the south, we do expect winds by Tuesday afternoon to pick back up to gale force. South winds ahead of it 30-35 knots. On the backside, northeast to north winds at 35 knots. And that will help to rebuild some of the waves there, especially on the North Pacific side. And then along the southwest coast into Bristol and Kuskokwim Bay, southwest winds 15 to 20 knots along the outer portion of the Yukon Delta. South-southwest winds 25 knots. Still south winds to 35 knots in through the broader expanse of Norton Sound, and west winds St. Matthew down to St. Paul at 30 knots with waves 15, 16 feet. And for Tuesday, with that low approaching the Aleutians coming up from the North Pacific, we expect winds to turn back to the east. 40-knot gales in the vicinity of the Pribilof Islands, waves 14 feet. East-northeast winds to 20 knots coming out of Bristol and Kuskokwim Bays. Still south-southeast winds 15 to 20 knots along the lower Yukon Delta and in through Norton Sound. And then finally, coming up through the Bering Strait, still on Monday, southeast to south winds to 35-knot gales, easterly east-southeast winds to 35 knots across the lower Chukchi Sea with the ice there in place. And then along the Arctic coast, strongest winds still 35 to 45-knot easterly gales from around Prudhoe Bay eastward through Kaktovik. There's still maybe some ground blizzard conditions linger there in through Monday afternoon. And then on Tuesday, we still do have some winds that hold up there along the far eastern Arctic coast, Kaktovik over toward the entrance of the Mackenzie River. But otherwise, they fall back off to about 25 knots, which is quite a bit downward from what they were earlier in the weekend. And then through the lower Chukchi Sea, 25 to 30 knot southeast winds. And still south of the Bering Strait, we expect winds to be south-southeast around 25 to 20 knots from Wales and off of Port Clarence to the north side of St. Lawrence Island.